was interesting. Okay. Um, I like Zoom. You don't have to stress out whether the ends of your tie line up at the bottom. It's kind of nice. I It's been a while since I've worked any miracles. One of the last ones I remember was I was in my office at the university, and a professor came in and said that there's a problem in a piano in a certain room, that the keys were sticking and the student was stressing out, and could I please come? So I grabbed my toolkit and went there, and sure enough, we were in this little room, and the student was showing me what the problem was, and she was playing some white keys, and they were sticking. They were totally staying down, and of course it was my job to fix the piano. So while she was turned and talked to the professor for a second, and then she turned back to the piano, and I said, could you show me one more time where the keys are sticking? And she started playing, and she said, they're not sticking at all. Not a single key is sticking. The entire piano's fixed. What did you do? And I just picked up my toolkit and walked out the door and said, no charge today. And I never did explain. All I really did was, while she was distracted, I reached down and pushed on the front of the piano action, and the whole thing moves, and it slid in just enough that the keys quit rubbing on the front of the piano. So the word got around that Mark could fix pianos telepathically, and I did nothing to counteract that. But you, people who I confide in, can know that it wasn't a real miracle. I've been reading the book of Matthew. It seems to, when times are stressful and I need a little comfort, I often read the Gospels. They're like old friends, and like many of you, I've been reading them for decades, and there's familiar things, but there's always new things. And I was reading the story of a particular miracle, and I've actually talked about this little miracle before, but every time I read things, sometimes, new things come up. So I wanted to go over this miracle, and it's in Matthew 17. And it's actually a very short section of scripture. It's the only place it appears in the Gospels. In Matthew 17, and starting in verse 24, it says, after Jesus and his disciples arrived in Capernaum, which is where he had a house, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax came to Peter and asked, doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax? Yes, he does, Peter replied. When Peter came into the house, Jesus was the first to speak. And that's translated a number of ways. The actual Greek is a little vague, and sometimes it's before Peter could get in the house, or as Peter was standing in the doorway. Anyway, Jesus headed him off, and Jesus spoke first. He'd seen this take place, apparently. And he said, what do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own sons or from others? From others, Peter answered, hoping he had the right answer. Then the sons are exempt, Jesus said to him. But so that we may not offend them, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you will find a 4 drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours. Now, this reads like a fairy tale. This reads like magic. This reads like, waving a wand and having very strange things happen. Was it like my miracle? Was there a better explanation for it? And I just want to go into a few of the points from this. It's interesting. I think it's the only place in the Gospels where it refers to people fishing the way we fish today, with a hook and line. Well, it doesn't mention a hook, but, it's not a boat and a net. This is just Peter fishing. And also, it's probably the only miracle that Jesus did that we know of where he did it not to offend people. I mean, he said that was the reason that he did it. But let's look at what's actually going on here. It's important to note where it fits into the whole story of Jesus' ministry, because if you look at the beginning of chapter 17, it probably says the transfiguration, and this is where he went up on the mountain with some of his disciples and met with Moses and Elijah. It was quite an event. And the magnificence of the event aside, one of the important things about this is after that, Jesus Christ was kind of obsessed with the fact that he was going to die, and understandably. As a matter of fact, I think it says in verse 22, after they had come down, it says, when they had came together in Galilee, so they were regrouping together with the other disciples, he said to them, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him, and on the third day he will be raised to life. And the tone of Jesus' ministry changes at this point, totally understandably. I mean, we know from earlier things in his ministry that he was always aware that it was the only way back to his Father, which is the way that it's actually expressed in other places in the book of Matthew. It talks about he knew that the time of his ascension to his Father was near. But from this point on, things changed a little bit, and he realized his time was limited and he had to get some things done. So let's look at this short little miracle and some of the points that we have. After Jesus and his disciples, back in 24 again, arrived in Capernaum on his home territory, which was up in Galilee. It wasn't Judah. The collectors of the 2 drachma tax, and drachma, of course, was a Greek coin, and the temple tax was 2 drachmas. There's some question about how much a drachma would be worth today. It doesn't really matter. The fact is, you know that 2 drachmas was the tax. And they came to Peter. It's interesting, they came to Peter instead of Jesus and said, does your master pay the tax? And Peter was on the spot. He'd already kind of made a fool of himself up there on the mountain. So Jesus had already recently corrected him. God the Father had actually corrected him, which is quite a distinguishing thing to have in your biography. So Peter might have been a little sensitive at this point, but anyway, he said, oh yeah, he pays the tax. I mean, maybe he had heard him say, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, you know, when Jesus held up a coin. This topic had come up before in a civil way, but this was the temple itself. And when Peter came into the house, in other words, when he and Jesus were together next time, Jesus collared him and said, well, what do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own sons or from others? And Peter got the point, and he said, from others. But how are they going to get out of this mess? Because Peter had already promised that they were going to pay it. Then the sons are exempt, Jesus said. And then he talks about the plan to catch a fish, and the fish would have the coin. Well, one of the interesting things that we've learned first here is that they didn't have the money. Because if they had the money, then they would just pay the tax right then and there, and wouldn't have to go through all this rigmarole, and things would be taken care of. But what were the exact mechanics of what was going on? I mean, Jesus he wasn't a magician. He had, as a matter of fact, it's quite possible he didn't have any more powers than you or I had. But what he did have was authority and access to God's way of accomplishing things. He could talk to his Father, or he could give orders, and things would be done. That was one of the points that the centurion brought out when he asked Jesus to heal his servant. And Jesus said, I'll come to your house. The centurion said, no, I get it. You have authority, and you have your staff, and they can take care of this. I don't have to have you come to my house. I'm not even worthy of that kind of thing. And Jesus didn't deny it. He did have access to the thousands and millions and however many angels there were in God's staff. He said later on in the garden, when the Romans were arresting him, he said, don't you know that I can call legions of angels? All I have to do is check with my Father, and they could come, and I could conquer the Roman Empire right now. But it wasn't the way things were supposed to work. And, you know, he had access. Once he was baptized, he grew up without access to angels. But once he was baptized, once he remembered who he was and was so close with the Father, there are times in his life when he just matter-of-factly worked with angels. If you recall, in Luke's account of his praying in the Garden of Gethsemane right before his death, that an actual angel came to comfort him. And we don't know what angel it was, but it would have been an old pal of Jesus's. And this was a very generous thing for God to do. And Jesus wasn't freaked out by the angel. I mean, this was something he knew existed and most of the time couldn't see, but at that point, an angel helped him. And we also know that right after he'd been baptized, when he was in the wilderness, after that whole event was over, that angels came and ministered to him and fed him. So he was used to calling on angels at that point. And, angels, I don't mean to say anything denigrating about angels, because God respects them. In some cases, it's clear that God and Jesus Christ even love the angels. They're not, they're different purpose than human beings. We are to become his children and his family, but angels are something that he created, and they do have the power to choose. We know that. And the loyal ones, God loves and respects and honors in his own way. We could talk about that later. But in some other ways, they're tools of God. And again, I'm saying that very carefully because they're much better than what we would call a tool. You know how much we depend on our phones. Some of you are holding your phones right now, reading scripture on them. Or laptops. We have those things, and they talk about how much we depend on them. Well, it's because it's like having a servant in your hand. You can find out anything you want to know with the right app, and God's angels are kind of that way. God doesn't have to be able to do and know everything. He can know what he wants to know. That much seems clear, but he can not stress about it and let the angels do things like, that's why he has 7 eyes to record all that's going on. He doesn't have to do that kind of thing himself. And so Jesus Christ probably didn't know where the nearest coin was that he was going to pay this, but he had access to an app which was called Find My Drachma. And what he did was he called on the staff that was available to him. And perhaps he took care of this before he even talked to Peter there, because he seemed to have it in mind. But at any rate, he could probably do it right then, mentally. And he said, where is the nearest coin? I don't have it. Where can we get it? Well, it's on the bottom of the lake. Okay. Well, what's our delivery system? How can we do this? And I like to think that maybe he juiced it up just a little bit, made it a little weird so that he could get Peter's attention this way, because it's an odd way of doing it. But how is he going to get this coin to Peter? Well, angels, one of the things the spirit world can do is work with creatures in the physical world or forces in the physical world. And it seems like living things actually have a link to the spirit world. I mean, sometimes we even call it a spirit. But so angels would come along and had the fish scoop this up, and then the idea was that Peter would be standing there. Well, it was a reasonably simple thing to get the fish to take Peter's bait at that point. And how did Jesus even know there was a fish, and how did Jesus know it would be the first one? Well, his staff could take care of that. And so it seems like magic to us, but it was forces that were at Christ's disposal. And of course, it's not something that we can do. So it's pretty magnificent that he could carry that off. But it's not. It wasn't as difficult for Jesus as it would be for us to grasp it. And it's interesting also that Jesus asked for a double portion. He asked for enough for 2 people, because if Peter went and paid the tax for Jesus, they'd say, "Well, what about you?" But he didn't ask for it for all the disciples. He just had enough. This coin that they found, 2 drachmas was the tax, and the coin that they found was specified to be a 4 drachma coin. Usually it's not that specific, but in this case it is. And it shows that he wanted to do it to avoid offense. Peter had already gotten him into this mess, and this was a way to get out of it. But his mind really wasn't on that. He didn't care about paying for the other disciples at that point. He considered it a minor thing, because he had, pardon the expression, bigger fish to fry at this point. He was dealing with his death and the things that he had to get done before he died. And really, when you read this miracle, and it's easy enough to read, it's only a few verses, it kind of becomes clear that it isn't about the fish and it isn't about the coin. It's about Jesus and Peter and how they work together. And Peter was a creation of Jesus. Peter was a fisherman. Jesus met him, and even the first time that he talked to him at great length, he started on the remake. He started on the what do they call it when somebody on TV gets their hair done and the makeup and a total, what do they call that? A makeover. So he gave Peter a makeover. One of the first things he said to him was, well, your name is Simon. And it's interesting that he goes back to that old name in this miracle. He says, your name is Simon, but I'm going to call you Rock. That's going to be your name, and you're going to be a rock. Well, that's not normal. What kind of person does that? What if I met Jim Housen for the first time, and I'm meeting Jim Housen, and he says, hi, I'm Jim Housen. I say, well, hi, I'm Mark Graham, but I shall call you, your name is going to be Doorstep from now on, and many shall stumble over you. I mean, it would be as weird today as it would be back then. People just didn't do that. But he gave him a new name, and then he worked very hard to make sure that Peter lived up to that new name. And he was remaking Peter up there on the mountain at the beginning of chapter 17. And he knew that there was going to be some remaking between now and when he had to leave the church in the care of Peter and the other apostles. There were things that had to be done. There was a certain rooster involved in the process at this point. So this is more about Peter and Jesus. And we like to think that Peter had the faith to carry it out, but it's interesting where Matthew leaves us with this story is that we don't know if Peter ever went and caught the fish. We don't know. We just know the instructions Jesus gave him, but we don't know what happened after that. Maybe they thought about it and Peter said, we can just live with this. Or maybe he went and he caught the fish. It's something to ask in the world tomorrow. We can ask, I won't bother Jesus with the question. I'll ask Peter. No, I won't ask Peter. I'll ask one of the other apostles and they'll go, oh yeah, Peter. Yeah, well, you know what he was like. And we'll get the straight scoop from them, John or his brother Andrew. Anyway, there'll be lots to talk about in the world tomorrow. But the point is that this is really about the relationship between Jesus and Peter. He had to gird Peter for the work that would be done. And Jesus was always thinking forward at this point in that mood. Well, in some ways, it's a small miracle, but there's so much that we can learn from it. And I hope that you can take this kind of thing and apply it to other small stories in the Bible and see all the many layers of things that we can learn about God and his relationship with us.